Welcome to Launch, the GCC podcast. I'm your host, Marty Duren, Director of Communications for the Great Commission Collective. We're a global network of churches partnering together to plant churches and strengthen leaders. This year in the Great Commission Collective, we are really emphasizing church planting, and why not? We are a church planting network, and our mission statement includes planting churches and strengthening leaders. So my guests today are Jerry Lingenfelter and Nate Newell, both of whom serve at Mission Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I'm really happy that they're here. Perhaps as we talk about church planting, some of the things that you think about are, how can my church best do this? How can we structure to keep church planting at the forefront of all that we're doing? And maybe some other things related to that. Well, this conversation with Jerry and Nate is very enlightening. They talk about how they think about these things. They talk a little bit about what God has done over the last few months to prepare them to be effective in this direction. And I think it's a helpful conversation, and I hope that you will enjoy it. I'm joined today on Launch by two guys that are no strangers to, one of them is pretty strange, but neither one of them are strangers to the GCC family. Pastor Jerry Lingenfelter and also pastor, but that's not your official title, Nate Newell. Nate, what is your title?
So I got a long fancy title now. It's the interim pastor of ministry and mission development.
That's awesome, man. Your business card now has to be like a 16:9, like a movie screen width to get all that on there, right?
That's right. They're printed poster size.
Yes, sir. That's great. So you guys are in, Jerry, you say it like, I don't say it the way you say it. I say Lancaster. That is obviously not the way to say it. Where are you?
That lets the residents know you're a foreigner.
I know.
So it's Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Come on, you can say it, Lancaster.
I would sound so bad. Ask Nate how I say the word of the city where he lived like 6 months ago. I can't even get in the neighborhood of right on that one.
Nope, that's right. That's okay. Other side of the world. So we'll just let that be.
So we're going to be talking about church planting and leadership development and how those are related. So Jerry, why don't you talk a little bit about where Mission Church is, kind of how you got to where you are, and then how Nate got involved in this. And then Nate, we'll go over to you for your story about how you pulled into this.
Yeah, so Mission Church became Mission Church by name just a couple of years ago, and we really sought after the Lord to lead us to a name that really defined who we are as a church. And so Mission Church is the full name. The mission is what we're about, and the church is who we are. And as part of who we've been over the course of the year is really been defined by the mission of God, our desire to make disciples and multiply churches to the glory of God. But ultimately, that bridge in between, of course, of making disciples and multiplying churches is the development of leaders. And that's really been like a real heartbeat of what fires our church up and gets us moving. And so it kind of leads us even into the reason why Nate is here with us at Mission Church.
So before we ask Nate how God got him to Mission Church, talk a little bit about how you think about, or how your church thinks about, leadership development. So that's obviously a big component if you're going to be making disciples and planting churches and all those kinds of things. There's several steps from a person who comes and follows Christ in baptism before you're sending them out to be a church planter. Talk a little bit about how your leadership development works.
Yeah, so we really see leadership development as discipleship pathway, right? And from the moment a person steps in the door, we think of them again needing the gospel of Jesus Christ, and having received the gospel of Jesus Christ. From that moment, we treat them like a leader. And I know that the jury's out on that, and maybe that statement even catches people a little off. Everybody's a leader, but the reality is, what are we doing in discipleship but teaching people to lead their lives in submission to Christ? And I just think there's something about treating someone with the dignity and the respect that comes, and even the expectations, like the spiritual expectations that come with leadership. And so all the way from our welcome and hospitality process, even our discover, consider mission class, we're laying the foundation and vision for, hey, from the moment you walk in the door, we believe God has a plan for your life, and he desires for you to lead your life as a loved and sent disciple of Jesus. And so our mission statement is to live loved and sent to the glory of God. We're making disciples who live loved and sent to the glory of God. And we wrote recently a 4-week commit to mission track or class, if you will, that really lays down 4 key commitments that really stick with the life of discipleship and leadership development in our church. And so we have a welcome to mission track, which lays the foundation. We then have a growing at mission track, which takes those 4 core convictions, which are, number 1, we commit to mission. Secondly, we commit to maturity or growing in Jesus. Number 3, we commit to ministry, which is serving Jesus. And then number 4, we commit to multiplication, right, which is multiplying the mission for Jesus in our context. And so our growth track then takes each one of those commitments and builds out on it at a discipleship growth level. And then welcome track, growth track, then we have our leadership track, which takes those 4 commitments again. And so commit to mission, we take our leaders through a biblical theology of Acts. And then commit to maturity. We then have a Pauline epistles class. So we're laying a foundation for biblical theology and how to grow in the context of the family of families, the church. And then our commit to maturity track, we have an essentials of sound doctrine that we take our leaders through. And then committing to multiplication, we have a leaders in the early church course that really helps them see their place as a leader in helping to multiply the mission. And that kind of leads us to where we are now with the next step in this whole process is people who are beginning to mature through and become equipped through our ministry and leadership training process. How do we equip them with the proper skill sets to be launched onto ministry teams and sent from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, into the region and the world? So long answer, but you asked for the kind of the scope. Yeah. That's how we're thinking of it, from literally from parking lot to part of a team.
That's awesome.
Yeah, for sure.
So Nate, when these conversations were taking place over the course of the last year and a half, you were not in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. You were on the other side of the world. So for most people that are listening, at least GCC folks are at least familiar with some of what's happened, but do a little overview of what has taken place with you and your family from kind of mid-pandemic to now and how you wound up at Mission Church.
Yeah, sure. So we were living in the city of Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. I was pastoring an international church there called Harvest KL. And it just became more and more obvious as COVID as we all began to realize the seriousness and the totality of it, how it was impacting foreigners in the country of Malaysia, and massive influence at all different industry sectors. A lot of people were being forced to leave the country. They were in the midst of the difficulty to receive a visa. There was also just the country shutting down and not letting people in or out. And in the midst of all of that, it changed the dynamic of our church massively. And we came to realize that our presence there was more of a hindrance, which is a difficult realization to get to, but that the Lord was really actually going to be moving us out. And so that we made that decision in October, and then ultimately left at the end of December. was able to leave a 3-man elder team in place, and they're looking for a pastor. And that church, it hasn't stopped the church. It just has dramatically changed how that church is doing ministry there. And they still have a lot to figure out in that way. But in the midst of that, I was like, man, okay, Lord, if you're moving me away, we always said, we will persevere and fight to stay here as long as you have us, Lord, but make it obvious if you're done with us here. Well, he made it super obvious. And so then I was, at one point I was so focused on all that was going on, I suddenly realized, oh man, I need a job. Like there's something that happened here. And I didn't have a clue. And in the midst of a pandemic, how do you find a job? And, we had been, not only do I have a good friendship with Jerry, but we have a long relationship. I was actually hired at this church in 2007 to plant a church on the southern end of Lancaster County, which we did in 2008. And so 13 years ago, I was on staff here at this church, and they really launched me into and commissioned me into church planting ministry. I served at Oak Hill Fellowship Church, which is a GCC church that Ben Miller now pastors, and served there for 7.5 years before the Lord called us to KL. Okay. And so as Jerry and I got to start talking about it all, you pick it up from there.
Yeah. So, having been the church that had the privilege of launching Nate and Marie, commissioning, laying hands and sending them out, we began to pray and say, what is our responsibility as a sending church? Although
that's a great question. Man, that's just really, really good.
And Marty, here's the thing, right? Like the responsibility led us to an opportunity. And I think when you're willing, to basically just come to the scriptures and ask the question, what does the Lord have for us in this? What is the Lord doing in our ministry partner's life? And really this comes back to one of the core values of being kingdom focused within the GCC, and really valuing partnership. But even more than the partnership piece was we laid hands as an elder team on this couple, even though it was one generation in between where he was currently, but from where he started, right? Paul took multiple trips, but he still came back to Antioch, right? So we're asking the question, what is our responsibility here? And we believe that we had out of that, the responsibility was to care for the one we sent. And that responsibility led us to the opportunity to say, here we have a gifted man, right, on the other side of the world, which the Lord's already confirmed to us that he is suited and that he's been gifted to do the work of ministry, church planting. But then even within his experience within church networks and within leadership development and much of his background, we also believe that the opportunity stood before us to have a man who could help fulfill some of our vision here, which was leadership development. And so we look throughout the first century church and we watch how the Lord used calamity to move his workers. And we just simply said, come on, it might be the 21st century, but we believe God still uses circumstances like this to redeploy his leaders into different contexts. And we just felt like we were being obedient at this point. Our leaders, our elders prayed and fasted on the matter. And we just felt very, very led and convinced that this was the next step for us.
That's fantastic. So in GCC, we've been talking about how discipleship pathways and leadership development lead into church planting. Talk a little bit about how you think about whether you've made a decision, whether God's made it clear exactly what's going to take place with Mission Church in that, but talk a little bit about how you're thinking through that, what it might look like in some kind of medium term, if not long term, for your church to be using this to plant churches.
Yeah, that is so good. And man, there's so many places to start really in that answer. And one of the things that's fascinating is the fact that our church, by and large, hopped on board with this opportunity as well.
That's great.
And I think it happens for a couple of reasons, but we've really preached and really pushed leadership development as a means of theological conviction. Like, I think we've all been there in ministry where pragmatically we get it. We're not going to go any further if we don't multiply leaders. Like we get the pragmatics of that. But when we see it as a biblical principle that you start with, not something that you back into by need, right? Jesus called the masses, but he got away and prayed, and he appointed the 12, and then he sent them out and he multiplied his ministry. You see Paul, his pattern of going into strategic cities, preaching, then cycling back and strengthening those churches, and then ultimately appointing leaders. You remember he gets stoned and left for dead, and then he goes back to those churches, and then he appoints leaders, which gives him the ability to essentially continue to move on with what he's doing. And then by the time God's progressive revelation it essentially fulfills itself, if you will, in the pastoral epistles, Paul says to Timothy, "Come on, entrust to faithful men that which I've entrusted to you." That this idea that it is a theological conviction that we raise up leaders. And so it allows us to kind of stay ahead, if you will, by God's grace of what's coming. And so our people, when new leaders are appointed, it actually becomes a celebration point, right? It becomes something that is applauded. And when our pastors are able to go and serve, right, our people see that the church is strong enough for us to be commissioning out. And now, the Lord has grown in a way that we're able to now bring in and be able to staff for this as well. And so that's a little bit about like kind of the infrastructure in the thought process and the conviction that gets us here. But in terms of what the Lord actually is placing on our heart, Nate, you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think in this too, like one of the things that was said in the GCC plant conference workshops, John Crabtree and Christian McNeely led one of those seminars, and they said at one point, leadership development in church must be intentional. And I really like the idea that leadership development must, let's start there. It must happen. It's a theological conviction of ours. And part of the reason is, while everybody understands that there's a pragmatic, like, oh man, we're growing, we need new small group leaders. If it's just pragmatics, you're too late to the game. You can't catch up with the need that you have for leaders. And so everybody feels behind the 8 ball on that. But when it's a theological conviction, and so it's something that you start with from the very beginning. And so you're invested in developing leaders, and you're paying, you're spending the time and the money and whatever from the very beginning, even on a small scale. You reap the benefits of that because God's way is always the best. It's a theological conviction. He wants us to develop leaders. You don't wait to do that until after everything else gets set up. You got to do that from the beginning. And even when I planted the church the first time, I realized I started too late. And so now just the realization of we've got to be doing this from the very beginning. And then when you do, your responsibilities and opportunities come together the way it has even in my own story and interactions with all of this. And so we're convinced, and not just because we think it's a good idea, but because we really do believe that the Bible does instruct us to act in this way. And so we're trying to, we're still learning, figure out how to, it's a conviction, but we're still learning how to practically pull that together. And I guess that's a lot of what my responsibility and role in this next season of our church is in that way.
I would also mention this as well. The Dave Harvey in the plant conference, when he did his multiplication session, that just the affinity that we felt in the rollout, right, of discipleship pathway, going to leadership pipeline, which leads to planner preparation, which ultimately culminates in the church planning church. We're looking at that discipleship pathway, leadership pipeline, and how those two things flow together, but saying, we're asking this question, and this is what we're trying to answer. How does a church build a leadership pipeline that actually can fill the church planner preparation track? Realizing that not every leader that we have the privilege of, ministering with and coming alongside, and, we equip, we're being equipped even as they're being equipped, right? Not everyone's going to raise to the level of planting a church. They may not be gifted in that way, but we think there's also a unique opportunity to raise up team members for the church planter. And so we just have a unique staff here where our worship pastor, Brett Laverne's been on staff for 20 years, to have 20 years
Wow.
of tenure in a role of worship. And our student ministry and discipleship pastor has been here for over 10. And our ministry and care pastor was a founding member of the church. And so we just have a lot of tenure here. And a piece of the vision is, can we utilize some of the experience that we have on the team to raise up team workers that then could be commissioned out to support church planting works within the GCC, within our region? And we see the issue of team. The Pauline team, for sure, in the first century was crucial to the work of church planting. Could we be a contributor? We're asking that question. Could we be a contributor to raise up team members?
So when I think about the New Testament, I think of two things. You have Jesus looking over the fields and seeing that they're white to harvest. And then you have Paul on one of his trips who sees a vision of a man in Macedonia saying, hey, we need some help over here. When you're thinking about your field, and I'm not asking like for a specific neighborhood, but when you're thinking about your field, are you looking in like with both of those tensions in mind, where you're looking at, point A, point B, point C, like a church is needed there, a church is needed there, a church is needed there. But also, what if somebody walks in and said, hey, man, we need a church in our community? So are you working with that tension of where you see versus being ready for God to send somebody and say, this is really where you need to go?
Yeah, thanks for scaring us again, Marty. We very much want to build a leadership pipeline where we're commissioning people to mission from within our church, and that's really our priority. But we also recognize not a responsibility to kind of a global sense of that, as well as just the opportunities that come. Like once you start building leadership pipelines and leadership tracks, that attracts all sorts of people who come and say, hey, can you help us get to wherever we're going from wherever we are? And so our heart beats for that. But man, we just know that the task is so significant that so I say it's scary because the vision, I think, has to include some of the wider scope of things, while we try to initially focus on building some things for our own church here that produce leaders that we send out, and then eventually equipping other teams down the road. We'll just see what the Lord gives us the opportunity for, and try to be faithful for those things as they come.
But it is amazing what fills your calendar, right? And meetings that come about based on just simple vision, right? And so in the last couple of weeks, even a meeting request from somebody in our church who is driving into church, but they just really have a passion for a church in their specific community. And they're beginning to ask the question, what would it look like to plant a church in my community? Like a GCC church, like a mission church. But then at the same time, we also have on our schedule a meeting to talk with somebody internationally as well, right? Who wants to come be part of and then be recommissioned out.
Wow, that's awesome.
You see this idea within the first century of almost a spontaneous expansion, right? Where the church is trying to catch up with what the Holy Spirit is doing in the hearts of people. So I see it as a both and. We want to be strategic, purposeful, good stewards of what God's given us in one hand, but then be open-handed on the other side to say, God's also leading individuals and placing desires on people's hearts. And what's the church do? The church confirms that giftedness, or equips the skill set necessary to recommission that one. Let's not squash the zeal. Let's bolster the strength that can foster the zeal for the work. But having good, strong elders who see leadership development and seeing their role as commissioning agents and discerners of giftedness, man, I think that's the
game
key.
changer.
That's the key.
Yep.
Jerry, right here as we're approaching the end, talk to the pastor of a smaller church who maybe there's 2 or 3 elders all together, just maybe 1 or 2 part-time staff members, and this guy wants to do church planning. He wants to be obedient in that way, but that task seems like it's the 13th thing maybe on the priority list, that if it happens, it would be like 2 or 3 years down the road. And we may or may not get to it because of all the ministry that we have to do hands-on. Give that particular pastor some encouragement, or maybe even some ideas of how to view this to where it doesn't seem maybe quite as daunting.
Yeah, man, for me, my mind and my heart immediately goes to the concept of network. Mm-hmm. And that we, with across the national and the global landscape, each GCC pastor, right, we have our portion of God's field, right? We are shepherds of God's flock in our context. And I know for me, like when we call ourselves Mission Church and we're telling people we're here to make disciples who are loved and sent to the glory of God, one of my passions is to help the mom sitting in worship service understand that her contribution to the mission this week is raising up godly kids. That dad, your role to the mission this week is loving your wife and investing in your kids so that your household looks like the household that God desires it to be. Because as you have a strong household, you get to contribute then to the household of God, which then gets to contribute to the broader framework. And I think similarly, churches of all sizes, as we faithfully minister to God's field in our context, we are indeed providing, we are contributing to the mission. And as those folks mature in Christ and resources become available, as those folks that you're investing in week after week after week grow in leadership, eventually around here we say eventually somebody pops. Right. And just stay faithful. Keep shaking that popcorn pan, because eventually, right, something is going to pop. So just continue to be faithful and do what God's called you to do. Preach the word, develop leaders to the best of your ability. And for me, that's as simple as inviting people along. And a very practical thing that I do each week as a personal means of leadership development, apart from the leadership classes that I teach, is that we have a service review every Friday. And I invite the pastors and then other leaders from the church to sit through a read through of my sermon, of whoever's preaching, and then critique, give feedback, and ask any questions they want to ask about the weekend's message, and they get to contribute and collaborate with the weekend service. Awesome. Right? That's just a simple way that you're inviting people in a modeling way. So that's a broad scope of what I would say to the pastor, but then there's also a practical thing that's something you already do that will benefit you and your leading and preaching, is to invite up and coming leaders to be part of that process. It's been huge.
Yeah, that process is it's humbling, and yet I think it's just a great model of how we can be investing in the next generation. It's not telling somebody, it's inviting them in. And I think that's a big part of leadership development, and that can happen at any scope, at any level. And so even as we think about, okay, you don't have the ability to hire a staff member to do leadership development. That's okay. Leadership development starts in the discipleship level. Like, just disciple people well, and you're going to need to multiply and have other people disciple, and that's leadership development right there. And while it may not have the reach into a church planting in a region or worldwide, if you keep doing that well, you will definitely have that opportunity down the road. And so just do the fundamentals, disciple people well, then turn them into leaders. And you're going to have opportunity to turn them into then commissioned individuals into teams and church planting and such.
Yeah, Apostle Paul says we all have gifts that differ. I'm inclined to believe that churches as well within the network each have a personality, temperaments, and gifts that differ, right? And when we're all doing our part, large and small, we all bring something very significant to the table that keeps the mission moving forward.
Yeah, really think, make sure you make it a priority.
Yeah.
So I think of, just because it's so closely associated with me, but Ben Miller down at Oak Hill Fellowship Church is doing an excellent job of developing leaders, and he's taking them through preaching cohorts and men's ministry events that produce leaders, and that's something that anybody can and should be doing, but to
Yeah.
make it a priority, you have to schedule it. You have to invest resources into it. You have to celebrate it. You have to be ready for it and cast vision for it. And so, like I said at the beginning, if you wait for the pragmatics, you're too late. It has to be conviction from the beginning. Start at the beginning, doing leadership development, doing these activities, and you'll get opportunity.
Right. Schedule a leadership training class. Schedule it. Just put it on the calendar and then promote it and say you're having it. And if one person shows up, you have the best breakfast with that guy you could possibly have, and you pour into that guy that shows up, because even if he's not your next key leader, he's going to sharpen you and your ability to make leader. Schedule
That's
it.
awesome.
Put it on the calendar.
Well, Jerry and Nate, this is going to be helpful to a lot of people. I really appreciate y'all's time, and pray God's blessings on you guys at Mission Church in Lancaster as you are surveying the field and being open to the people that God brings to you.
Thank you, friend.
Thanks, Marty.
Thank you for listening to Launch, the GCC podcast. If you haven't subscribed already, why not take a moment to do that in your favorite podcast app? Also, rate and review the podcast when you get a moment. That helps us with search results. And recommend us to your friends, maybe other pastors that you know who will benefit from the content from this podcast. Also, don't forget to check out our website if you haven't done that already. It's gccollective.org. That's gccollective.org. And there's a lot of helpful information. There's articles. There's how you can join the GCC, whether a church planter or an existing church, and plenty of other content that'll help you grow spiritually and encourage you in your leadership journey.